Welcome to another episode of the Church Things podcast, where, believe it or not, we talk about church things. And today we are in the new studio for the Church Things podcast. And so first, I just want to take a moment to admire the things that we hung on the wall. That's nice. And in the studio today with me, I have Tim Beasley and Braxton Schulte. And I think this podcast is going to be titled Discipleship, our conviction in our shortcomings. And so we want this podcast to be just a time where we kind of talk about some of the behind the scenes and the conversations that we're having, just as a leadership and with our members and things like that. And one of the things we've been talking a lot about recently is discipleship. And Tim, could you just share kind of how that came about, or maybe Braxton could, because you were just kind of talking before we started recording. Maybe you're the original.
No,
Jesus is the original one to come up with this, but how did this all come about?
So I think we've been having conversations about how we get our people engaged. And for years we've talked about identifying who is discipling you and who you're discipling. But I think about the time that Braxton did his sabbatical, we kind of saw this resurgence of discipleship focus. We attended a workshop in the spring, and it seems like at least what the Lord was doing in Braxton, what the Lord's doing in me, what the Lord's doing in you, kind of lined up with what training kind of became available. And so it kind of feels like the perfect storm that all this stuff hit at the same time. But that idea of being able to identify from a personality standpoint, who is the person who is gleaning from you, and who are you gleaning from? And I think for a long time we've tried to identify that as a question, and really kind of frustratingly so, that we don't really have a structure or a system by which to do that.
Yeah.
Because it tends to be organic. It tends to be relational. So,
yeah.
Yeah, I'll add on to that part of my evaluation during sabbatical, like personally, was trying to figure out, okay, where have I seen fruit, of these years of trying to pour into people? Where have I seen people actually become like Jesus? And as I was evaluating everything, it's like, I think it's when I'm able to have more personal interaction, life-on-life conversations, and doing life together with the people that I see life change there. There was intentionality. And so I just, in that moment, made a decision for myself as an individual. I'm like, I don't know. I think this is where a church is supposed to go, but maybe it just starts with me individually committing to disciple making. And so I made a commitment right then and there that I'm going to choose a group of guys, a small group, 4 or 5 guys, and I'm going to meet with them weekly to do like intense life-on-life discipleship.
I think too, one of the fascinating things is when we're having this conversation, and for the folks that are listening to our dialogue here, I can clearly articulate who has discipled me over the years.
Yeah.
That list of names is easy for me to tell you that, Paul was a guy, and Harv was a guy, and John was a guy, and they all poured into me, leaned into me intentionally. And yet I can't tell you what curriculum they used. I can't tell you. Yeah, there were a couple of books that we went through, talking about leadership. But it was life on life. It was intentionally, and I think that's a great word that Braxton used, that there was intention that they were going to pour into me. The harder thing, and I think what kind of keeps us up at night, is who am I discipling? Am I intentionally reaching somebody? And I think that's been part of the focus that we've had over the last 9 months to a year.
Mm-hmm. I think part of the thing that's kind of kept us up too is just how do we don't want our people to think that like disciple making is for the professionals. Right. And so it's like, well, Well, individually, we're thinking, okay, who am I personally discipling? So it's like Braxton saying, I'm taking these 4 or 5 guys. You're saying, I'm taking these 4 or 5 guys. But it's like, if okay, well, that's only 10 people. You know what I'm saying? And so it's like, we have to figure out a way to, build systems into our church where this is more widespread. And out of our conversations that we've been having there, we've kind of come up with these 5 questions that I was going to read that we've been wrestling with as a staff. And so the first one is, how do we connect disciples to disciplers? And then who are the disciplers? And that one is something that we've really been wrestling with in the college.
And it's a great question, because I think it's got a word in there that isn't really a word.
Yeah, definitely like 3 not. It's kind of like
we're making
attractional,
For sure.
Yeah, that's what we do with our Christianese. We just start making up words. But that's something we've really been working through in the college age, because, like every week, in our announcements, I put up this slide. It's just my phone number. And I say, call me, text me. I'll buy you lunch. I'll buy you a cup of coffee. I'd love to sit down and talk to you, But it's not just college students. Everybody is, they're like, oh, that's a nice sentiment. But then you get out there in the week and you kind of forget about it, But to have someone who's almost like assigned to you, that's a little, if they don't meet you that week, they're going to be hitting you up. Hey, missed you last week. We're going to catch up this week, And so part of what we've started doing is just signing. We got college students to sign up and say, I want someone who will disciple me. And then now I'm making a lot of phone calls every day saying, hey, would you be willing to take on a college student and meet with them every week and disciple them, And so that's part of it. It's just like, we're kind of starting from scratch on, what is this? What does this look like? How do we make it happen? Because we spend a lot of our time doing programs, building a program.
So in a lot of ways, I think we have relegated discipleship to what you're talking about in the programming. And we do structure ministry and we do program ministry because that provides some opportunity for growth and for teaching, and yes, for discipleship in some ways. But I think we mistakenly think if somebody is in a Bible study that they're being discipled. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean Bible study is not part of discipleship. Surely it is. Yeah. But just attending a Bible study or just being in a small group does not necessarily mean that you are being intentionally discipled, that we're doing life-on-life relationship that is for the purpose of spiritual growth and kingdom work. And so that's been kind of one of those nuanced things that it's like we have a vision for what this looks like. And it's not just, can we get more Bible study leaders or can we just get more 242 leaders? That's not necessarily what we're talking about. And that's difficult because all those things are really important to us. Yeah. And it is, college ministry is important, but just because a college kid's here on Tuesday night does not mean they're being discipled. Yeah. Without that one-on-one touch. And so,
part of it is that's not our idea. That's what discipleship looks like. That's really Jesus's model of discipleship. Yeah. And so we see in the Gospels that he does spend a lot of time teaching and preaching, but he spends much more time being with his disciples, and eating meals with them, doing every day and doing ministry alongside them, showing them, and so obviously part of that is, we're searching the scriptures together. We're talking about what the scriptures say. But a lot of it's if I'm only ever hearing it as like sitting in a chair, hearing someone give a lecture on it, essentially, how much of that is now watch me do it. Now do it as I do it. Those different stages that we'll sometimes talk about, but
which is where the conviction comes in, where it's all the above. And oftentimes it's easier in the programming aspects of ministry to say we can scale this to the size that we can have lots of people sitting in this room to hear Jesus' teaching. And we want that. Jesus did that. He taught to the masses. But we also need to not just have people hear what Jesus taught, we need them to experience the rhythms he lived. And so where can we, on a smaller scale, on a personal scale, how can we implement, we're going to have Jesus rhythms in our life, not just Jesus teachings in our life?
Yeah. And I think even just, we think of it often when we talk about the Great Commission and Matthew 28. I was actually just going to read it for us because I think it highlights part of what we're talking about with this. It says this. It says, "Then Jesus came to them and said, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age.'" I think sometimes we think of the Great Commission as this is essentially instructions for lost people, right? It's this is how we evangelize. And while I think it is that, I think a lot of discipleship is go and find people who are far from God and bring them in to, the family of God. And so part of that is, going to the ends of the earth, and we start with Fort Smith, and then we go to the state of Arkansas, and then we go across the country, and now we're taking mission trips or flying to other places, and so that we can bring the gospel to them. We, preach the good news. We baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But it's how are we teaching people to obey everything that Jesus commanded? And so part of it, I think, is that we preach sermons and we lead Bible studies, and we do those things in a way where sometimes it almost feels like, and maybe this is just my own conviction, but I'll preach a sermon where I preach the teachings of Jesus in a way that I want it to seem like, I want to almost convince you that you should, because your life will be better if you follow Jesus. It's your marriage would be better if Jesus was in it. Your relationship with your kids would be better if Jesus was in it. But also, me communicating to you why you should obey him because he said to obey him, that doesn't just happen from a stage. It doesn't just happen even on a retreat or a trip. It has to, hey, we're sitting down and we're talking and we're getting real about what does it look like for you in this situation to submit to the lordship of Christ. And those are a lot of times conversations and things that come out that can only come out in that setting. And I think that's why Jesus modeled it that way, is because he's this is something I'm not just going to communicate from a stage.
I think it's easy to be holy or to look right when you're prepared.
Yeah.
It's a much harder thing to do, to be like Jesus when you're not prepared, when you're just living life. And I think that's part of discipleship is yes, it's in the preparation. It's when we do a Bible study specifically, but it's also when we do lunch. It's also when we're driving down the road. It's when you get pulled over for speeding, or when you say something you shouldn't say, and discipleship is not just the things that I'm prepared for, but it's the way I live life. And I think oftentimes, when we talk about discipleship in the home, there are things that as a pastor, I never wanted people to know happened in my home. And every time I brought my kids to church, that was the risk, is that they're going to say, guess what my dad did? But the reality is, if I can teach about the Lord, and if I can model how to live even when I mess up with my kids, if I can be real with people, that I think is the component of discipleship that doesn't happen with just simply doing a Bible study, or just simply going to church. It's that doing life when the unexpected happens, and when reality hits, and when we mess up, and when we succeed. That's what discipleship looks like.
Yeah. So. And I think part of that too is it just it shows us that that following Jesus is attainable. I think sometimes we can preach sermons where almost the application almost seems grandiose, and you were talking about you can remember the times in your life that you were discipled by someone. And I remember so much of being discipled by people growing up was just them saying, I'm going to let you in on like you get to come over and just like when nothing's going on, like we're literally just eating dinner and like we're all just getting off work and we're just picking up the kids from school and like life's happening and you get to just come in and be a part of my family, And it's like what that taught me was, I think I can do that. Like I think I can, follow Jesus in the mundane, follow Jesus in the everyday life. I can go to work and I can follow Jesus. I can come home and I can follow Jesus, and I just seeing that it wasn't this big, a loft idea of, and I think maybe at the beginning of following Jesus, some of it needs to be that. Some of it needs to be, this very grand, Jesus is asking you to die to yourself and to pick up your cross daily. But it's like day in, day out, I need to know what does that actually look like? Like I need to see this in action so that I can do it,
And to that thought, maybe it'd be good for clarity's sake to think, okay, what is a disciple in the first place? We're going to toss around this term of what is a disciple? So then therefore, what is disciple making? And one of the frameworks that we've been kind of tossing around, and the idea of a disciple is someone who is believing in Jesus, who is letting themselves be changed by Jesus, and then they're joining in Jesus's mission. And so when we say we need to focus on discipleship, we're not trying to create people who can teach a certain lesson or who can do a certain task. It is this everyday living of, are you believing him? Are you letting yourself be changed by him? Can you point to a fact that you're joining his mission?
Yeah.
And so that for clarity's sake, I think that's what we're talking about.
No, that's helpful. Yeah. Yeah. And I think sometimes, we almost we're like, okay, well, maybe it's like teaching leadership, or like, maybe it's like, oh, well, like this person, like we're teaching this person like ministry skills, and it's like, I mean, those things are all good, and we need those in the church, obviously, but just, at a very fundamental level. And I think we even talked about this, like some of the language that I've used too is to be a disciple is to be with Jesus. And so like you spend time with him, you read his word, you pray to him, you do different spiritual disciplines like silence and solitude, and you fast, and all these things are to be with him. But then the second one is you become like him. And so over the course of your life, you are looking at, the fruits of the Spirit, and those fruits of the Spirit actually becoming your character. Like, when people describe you over the course of your life as you follow Jesus, you're someone who is kind, and you're someone who speaks the truth, and you're someone who is, looks like you're literally becoming like Jesus. And then the last one is do the things that Jesus did, so you said join in on his mission, but it's very simply doing the things that he did. So what did Jesus do while he was on earth? And it's like, we try to, that's part of it where we're not saying like, throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're not just going to get rid of all of our programs at our church, and it's because we believe that the programs that we're building and the things that we do as a church those are the places that you can often do the things that Jesus did, and so,
Well, and I think Jesus models those different levels of influence. He spent time with the crowds. I mean, when they gathered around, Jesus took advantage of the fact that there were people there listening. He fed 5,000 people. Well, I don't know that what we're talking about is this intentional personal relationship was happening, but it was still valuable. Jesus was teaching and preaching the kingdom of God. That's necessary. He also dealt with what appears to be a little bit bigger crowd than just the 12.
Yeah.
There were some women involved in that, and there were some people that were part of that early group of followers. But then specifically the 12 with purpose, that he was leaned into these 12 guys on purpose, intentionally, because they were named.
Yeah.
But of the 12, there were 3 that Jesus was very particular about. They were there at the Mount of Transfiguration. They got to see some stuff that the others did not get to see.
Yeah.
Where Jesus, and it appears that those are the guys that were, Peter, James, and John seem to be the early leaders in the church. And so, as far as people looking like their leader, their discipler, these guys took on leadership roles because they were in intimate settings with Jesus. And so I think Jesus models that for us.
Yeah.
So there's nothing wrong with being in the multitudes. There's nothing wrong with being
leading
in a
small
medium-sized group. Right.
Yeah,
There's nothing wrong with being a part of a dozen or so. And all of those have specific purposes and value. But I think what we're saying, and I think the conviction that we came to was what was missing was who are the three? You know, who is that person that you're intentionally coming alongside? So as we're walking through the story of the early church in Acts, we're, you know, what we will find is Acts chapter 11 is the church is it's breaking out in the Gentile territory, and they send Barnabas to check it out. And the first thing he does, it goes and gets Paul. Well, you know, we think of Paul as this phenomenal leader, but if Paul didn't have the gravitas of Barnabas, the encourager, to say, no, he's a guy that's going to help us in ministry. If he didn't have Barnabas's authority and his commendation, I don't know where Paul would have been, you know? And then what you see, 5 chapters later, Acts chapter 16, Paul goes and he takes Timothy and begins to pour into Timothy. And so we can see this generational stuff in how discipleship works. And I think that's another key component we haven't really hit on yet, and that is the reproducible or the reproduction that happens in discipleship. Because, you know, we have the pastoral epistles because there were specific people that Paul took on and said, hey, follow me as I follow Christ. And so we see that generationally happening. And we see that over and over in biblical terms. So
I think part of that is like it's changing the mindset of thinking of ourselves as like when we say I'm a Christian in our current day and age, sadly, a lot of people have a lot of different ideas really of what that means. And one of the things that we've been talking about is just even changing the language of like, what does it mean to be a disciple? And, you know, part of what you were just saying is a disciple is someone who makes disciples who makes disciples. You know, it's like a disciple maker makes disciple makers. You know, and that's the only reason that any of us are here is because we come from a long line of people who made disciples. It goes all the way back to the early church, you know? And so, I think that's as we're wanting our people to think through who am I discipling, the end goal of that is that those people that you're discipling would go on to find their three, you know, and those three would find their three, you know, and you could quickly see how fast that multiplies, you know.
And I think that's part of our goal in discipleship is that our disciples don't just continue to hang out with us.
Yeah.
You know, there's an intimacy that goes with that kind of relationship that I think is long lasting. But our goal is not to be in this close, intimate relationship until the Lord returns. It is to develop and cultivate that Jesus culture, to look like him and then to serve like him so that we can send people out. And so, you know, I've watched Braxton's discipleship group meets next door to my office. You know, I've joked about, they're loud. I love listening to those, is it 5 guys or 6 guys? 5 guys.
6, including me.
You know, laugh and talk about stuff that, you know, and every once in a while I'll throw the door open and hand out candy or whatever, and they'll ask me a question. And it's like, this is really good stuff.
Yeah.
But what's more exciting than that is that, you know, Braxton has plans of these guys are also going to disciple somebody, you know, and how that begins to grow exponentially is pretty exciting.
And they know that expectation. I think part of
from the beginning, they know that expectation.
And so part of part of this, we want to be super organic. The desire in our mind would be like, I wish this happened organic in the church. And the truth is, we're finding the fact we need to add some structure. And so, to let you in on some of my structure is from the very beginning, and I laid out the framework of what this is going to be, that this is going to be intense, and we're going to be vulnerable with each other. We're going to be open. We're going to share sin stories and our testimonies, and we're going to walk through the things that Jesus did, and we're going to pray together, and we're going to fast together, and we're going to all the things. And one of the things in that first meeting was, and this is gonna have an end date, because I'll let them help choose the time. We picked 18 months. We're gonna do this for 18 months, and after that, we're gonna divide into smaller groups. We're gonna multiply. All right, and then those 2 guys are gonna grab 2 guys, and those 2 guys are gonna grab 2 guys. And so from the very beginning, they know the goal is to make more disciples.
Yeah, that's super cool. I think, what would you guys say, like, if someone's listening to this, or maybe they've even heard us talking about this in real life, not in the podcast world, like where would you tell people to get started? Because in some sense, it's like, we would love for it to be, hopefully somebody just comes up to you and they say, I need to know more about this Jesus person you follow. But the reality is, when that does happen, but where would you tell people to start? Because they're like, well, I'd love to start with you putting me in a group or something. I'd love for you to you start with discipling me, and then I can go disciple other people. But
so I think oftentimes whenever we've taught a lesson or preached a sermon and we talk about, figuring out who is going to disciple you, we have people all the time who come and say, I'd like to be discipled. If you can pair me with somebody who would lean into me to help me grow, to help me be like Jesus, to be a kingdom worker, I'll read their books, I'll meet with them, I'll do the Bible studies. But what I think keeps us up at night, and what really is difficult for us to structure and to prepare, is when we need to find the disciplers. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of the crux of the question. Is we have lots of people who are willing to who submit to somebody else as a disciple for the sake of growing, all the right motives. But oftentimes turning that corner, that our discipleship becomes reproduced in that disciple. That's kind of where we fall short. And I think that's kind of been the heart of, for us, how do we make this generational and cyclical, so that we have people who are doing our mission, who are bringing in and building up and sending out. Yeah.
Braxton, talk about that. Like that it's almost like a spiritual self-esteem issue that I think we often run into. That we think like, oh, I would love to be discipled, but like, I'm not, like, I can't do that,
Yeah, we hear that all the time. And I think we need to remember, or help coach and open people's minds to the fact that what we just said earlier, discipleship isn't necessarily a Bible scholar teaching scripture in this big way. It is someone who loves Jesus and is trying to do the things that Jesus did.
Yeah.
Are you willing to walk along somebody else and be real with them? Because sometimes the best moments of discipleship, I think we could all agree, is when somebody that you look up to is vulnerable about how they're having to walk through a hard time, or how they're having to practically, and just really, really small but important things, make intentional decisions in their life.
Yeah.
Anybody can do that. Anybody can be real with somebody else. And so that's where I think the line needs to be clearer for our folks that we're wanting to jump in here, because what we're talking about, it's the honest truth of our shortcoming. And they're like, okay, we don't really know yet how to ask everybody to do this. And so I don't know. Who knows what we're going to roll out? Who knows if we're going to have a sign-up sheet one time, or what we're going to do?
Yeah.
We don't know yet.
Yeah.
But I think too, we've tried, from a structural standpoint, to make this painless for folks who were willing to say, okay, if you think I can disciple, and we bought some books that have been actually very helpful.
Yeah. And for my college age leaders, we're about to put together almost like a training, essentially. Where we're going to say, here's the resources we have for you guys, some different things you can run through.
But here's what we've discovered. So I've got a college student that I meet with, and for the last 3 weeks, we have not opened the book. Mm-hmm. We're stuck on, I think the holiness of God is the lesson we're on. And, but a couple of weeks ago, we talked about, employment, and we talked about, what do I do for a career, and how do I earn money, and what should I do? I have $18 in my bank account. Yeah. And it's like, well, listen, dude, you need to earn some money, and I guess lunch is on me today because we're going to spend more than $18. And so we didn't even get to the structured part of this, but we're doing life together. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we don't see the value of just a meal around a table until 6 months, a year, 10 years down the road. But it's that availability to be able to say, hey, how do you do this as a dad? How do you do this as a husband? Or, when you really are struggling with a moral issue. Yeah. You guys are doing some discipleship stuff with the guys in the house, and my young man told me, "Hey, you ought to check out my inventory." And I'm like, I don't know that that's a word either, but we can't talk about that on the podcast. But it's so I think part of where we have to, if there's a goal that we have for today for this podcast, it would be some encouragement for people to be willing to engage this. And I've got a friend who's one of our church members who challenged me this way several years ago. He said, you have to answer the question, who are you? And are you somebody's who? Are you going to be the person that 10 years, 20 years from now, they say, that person poured into me? Yeah. And that sounds pretty exciting, as intimidating as it can be. Yeah.
And if we can embrace the fact that, okay, if what you're talking about is true, if I just need to be real with people and open to following Jesus in this type of a way, and seeing that the core mission of the church is to make disciples that make disciples. This is, when we talk about bring in, build up, send out, you could call that discipleship. Yeah. And so if you're willing to do that, if we can embrace that and buy into that as a church, then we as a team, we're working to find, there are books and there's curriculums, and we can encourage you on the lesson side of it, to have the meat that is good and healthy and true, and theology that is solid, that we can help you with those type of things. But more often, those meetings, like you're just describing, probably won't be all about the book or all about the teaching. It's going to be about the life.
Yeah. Right. And I think that's one of the things too, to remember, like, obviously we appreciate sermons and books and things like that. We teach on a regular basis, preach on a regular basis. But I think it's always like a good reminder that's like, if I want like really good Bible teaching, I can get on the internet and I can find that. You know what I'm saying? But what I can't just readily get on the internet is that relationship that we're talking about, And I think so often, I think about this, I wonder, like, if we, you're saying who are you? Like, I wonder if people know that they are someone, you know? And I even think about J.D. Williams, who is a longtime member at Central, was an elder. And I remember a few years ago at his funeral when there was hundreds of people there that literally would all say he was my somebody. He discipled me. And I remember sitting there thinking, like, I wonder if JD is seeing this now and saying, oh, wow, I didn't realize. Like, I was going and I was making disciples, and I didn't realize that this is what the end was going to look like. And it's like, it's sweet because he knows now, but just I think sometimes we can build it up in our heads that it has to be like this big, grand thing. And really what we want to challenge our people with is just that it can be more simple than I think sometimes we're not asking you to be a Bible scholar. We're asking you to be someone. Yeah. And I don't know why, but even for us, that can be intimidating. Yeah. And we, but it's important. Mm-hmm. And, I think the vulnerability is part of it. That's scary, but I think also that's the part that, like we were kind of talking about earlier, that makes it seem attainable. Like when I sit down with someone who's discipling me, and I'm going to them asking, how do I do this? And, tell me when I'm going to quit sinning ever again, and then when they're like, dude, like, I got mad at my kid for the same thing, that you're getting mad at your kid for. And it's like, oh, okay. And it's like, yeah, but this is how I repented of that. And this is how I wrestled with the Lord over that. And this is how I asked for forgiveness from my wife and my kids. It's like, and then, okay, well, it's like, yeah, that's scary for this person to open up and share that with me because, obviously I'm looking to them to see how this is all supposed to work. But it's like in that vulnerability, which is scary, that's where like it actually happens.
And part of what you're talking about is the hard thing about discipleship is we don't do a great job of getting spiritually exposed.
Yeah.
But the reality is, we're three guys on a church staff, and each of us are still a work in progress. Some of us are bigger works than others. But,
more so, yeah.
Both of us want to be like Braxton.
Yeah, it's true.
And but there's still a sanctifying work that goes on with each of us.
Yeah.
And so none of us would say, we would be embarrassed to say, come follow me as I follow Christ. But the reality is, come follow me as I follow Christ. If I've lived this life longer, if I understand some things differently, if I have had life experience that you've not had yet, then I do have something to share with you, even if it is I made these mistakes when I approach this. The other thing that I think is probably important for us as we talk through kind of the hardship of becoming a discipler is it requires time.
Yeah.
And culturally, we're not very good at that. I have set aside Thursday lunch, and I have blown it about half the time. But it requires that we set aside some time to be intentional about it. And we live in a culture, it's countercultural. We live in a culture that says we can't do the same thing all the time every week, and we have to.
Yeah.
And it requires us to think about grabbing that young man or young woman and saying, hey, come go to the store with me, or come make a hospital visit with me, or come, for me, it was, I went to lunch with a bunch of ladies, experienced widow ladies. I brought my young man with me. Come go with me. We're going to have tacos. Yeah. And he had no idea what he was getting into.
Yeah.
But they loved him.
Sweet free food. And
free food.
A bus full of widows.
A bus full of women. Yep. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So what would you, just to kind of close out, like what would you guys say what are some immediate steps we could take to become a discipler?
I laid out the challenge several weeks ago in a sermon that if you would like to be discipled, if you'll let me know that, I will make sure that there's somebody there to disciple you. And I had a guy who reached out that afternoon, and immediately I put it out to our leadership team. Okay, guys, I need you to put your
good
time.
On this promise I made.
Make good on this promise I made.
Yeah.
And we had three different guys on our leadership team said, hey, I've got capacity. I can do that. I think it is probably, for us, the bigger need is not people to be willing to be discipled, but people who are willing to say, I'll take that chance and I'll lead somebody. Yeah. And I'll lean into somebody. And if you'll give me a believer who's young in their faith or who's maybe doesn't have the experience, I'll meet with them and we'll talk through stuff and we'll study the Bible together and we'll talk about life. So I think the immediate need is we need some folks to just say, okay, put me in, coach.
Yeah.
And because we have a lot more people who are ready to be discipled than we have who are ready to be that person who's intentionally pouring in.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that'll take some willingness to carve out time. It'll take some willingness to reach out.
Yeah.
Because we don't know the right questions to ask to have this conversation with you personally sometimes. And so I think, man, it would be amazing if we had some phone calls and some texts and emails of saying, yeah, put me in, coach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or if you get a phone call, email, or text from us asking,
Say
try
yes.
it.
Yeah.
Say yes. Try it. Carve out time. and be willing to be real and be willing to let us coach you in the process.
Yeah, and I think both of you guys have done a really good job with that, of being able to say, hey, I've got a college kid, I've got a high school kid who needs somebody to lean in.
Yeah.
And I don't know that you guys have gotten a lot of rejection. So some of that's on us too, to make sure that we put the need out there.
Yeah.
But for those who are watching, if we call, we prayed about it and the Lord was clearly in it, and you should say yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think also, or sorry, were you going to say something, Braxton?
Yeah.
He's going to read the Bible.
Okay. I guess we could do that.
And here's a why. Here's why would I actually do what we're talking about here. This is John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35. A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. Love is the key. And so are you willing to love somebody because you've been loved by Jesus, and you will be noticed as a disciple because of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. You become a discipler because of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think also Braxton said something that is really key here, and that is you're not doing this alone.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know when we started talking about this podcast that it was going to wind up being this plea for people to disciple. But the reality is, if we had 50 people who said, I'll study with somebody, I'll talk with somebody, I'll have lunch with somebody, we could find them 50 people who would say, you mean they would meet with me and talk to me about Jesus and how to live my life the way Jesus lived his life and how to be a kingdom worker. Yeah. All day long we could pair those people up. But
I also think I think some of the cool, not only is some of the coolest stories we have, but I think also part of what Matthew 28 is getting at, the go and make disciples is part of it is if we never call, if the people who are listening to this podcast never get the call from one of us asking, I got somebody to pair you up with, that doesn't take away the fact that they're still called to go and make disciples. Yeah. And so what we're asking is that you would think about your circles of influence, think about where you spend your time during the week, think about who do I interact with, whether it's, at work, whether it's, parents on my kids' sports team, whether it's, I don't know where all these places are, but who's there that's lost and it needs to be, discipled, point blank. And so,
and for us right now, we're trying to facilitate that because we have this burden.
Yeah.
But I think you're right in that, we have a burden to connect disciples and disciplers together. But all of us as believers have the burden to make disciples.
Yeah.
It's the Great Commission.
Yeah.
And we don't have any choice in that if we're going to be followers of Jesus, that we go into all the world, that we make disciples, that we teach them what Jesus has commanded, because he's with us.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really not a discussion on whether we should do this. I mean, it's
part of our
really
obedience.
Not. Yeah.
We started talking about that we want to teach people to obey.
Yeah.
And part of our obedience is that we are going to intentionally make disciples.
Right.
Yeah. For sure.
So, I mean, for me, what we've talked about in our accountability as a staff team is if you can't identify the person or two or three that would identify you as their discipler, you're not doing your job.
Yeah.
And I think that all of us, all of our staff can identify who that person is.
Yeah.
Or two or three. And Braxton got 5.
Yeah.
It's probably too many.
Yeah.
Jesus said 12, so it's like Braxton's halfway there.
Yeah. Well, and I think you should go ahead and show this podcast to your guys and say, we're cutting one of you. And whoever doesn't produce.
Next week is going to be Survivor style.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
You are no longer a disciple.
We voted you off the island. All right. Hey, so we're going to wrap up, but we just want to say we hope you enjoyed listening. But also we want to hear from you. We don't want this to just be something that lives on the internet and we don't ever, get to talk to you guys about this. That's the whole reason we're doing this, is just to further the conversation, to start the conversation. And so please reach out. We'd love to talk to you about obviously what we talked about today, but also just anything you might have for us. If you want to hear something, us to talk about something on the podcast, if you want to have a conversation about something that we said, we'd love to. This is the part where, usually on Tuesday night at Abide, I put my phone number up on the screen and say, text me, call me, I'll get coffee with you.
At centralfs.org.
Yeah.
Staff at centralfs.org will get to all of our pastoral staff. And so if somebody said, hey, I think I might want to do this, if they send it to that, it'll be like sick them to a Doberman. You'll get 5 responses at least.
Yep.
Maybe 6.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. But hey, I think that's it for today. And we appreciate you listening in, and we'll see you next time.